Bibles, if you would, turn to Acts chapter 17, or excuse me, Acts chapter 27. Acts chapter 27. Don't want to go backwards. Acts chapter 27, as we continue our verse-by-verse study through this book, and we are making pretty good progress, I would say. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but I'm thinking we're just a couple of weeks here to the end. So by March, I believe. We should be done by March, I would say. But we've been working through some big chunks of the text here, and we'll continue to do so this morning as we look at the entirety, Lord willing, of Acts 27. We continue with a lot of narrative, a lot of progression in the story, and this morning in particular, what we are going to see is how God brings Paul to Rome via some very, again, perilous circumstances, unexpected ways that we will see here in the text. And I have entitled this message, The Royal Mediterranean. I know some of you have been on cruises and some of you enjoy going on cruises. I can promise you this is not the sort of cruise that you would have wanted to have been on. Much, much different than the way that we think of and view sort of voyaging and ships and passengers and everything else today. But certainly God uses even the perilous conditions to bring about his sovereign will and purposes. So we're going to look here at chapter 27, starting in verse 1, and we'll get a bit of an idea. You have on your notes there in your bulletin a picture which might come in handy as we sort of read through, especially some of these beginning parts of the text, to kind of picture where some of these things are taking place and the location of where this journey is beginning and how these events are playing out. But here in chapter 27, verse 1, it says this: "When it was decided that we should sail to Italy, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners to one named Julius, a centurion of the Augustan regiment. So, entering a ship of Adramyttium, we put to sea, meaning to sail along the coast of Asia. Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, was with us, and the next day we landed at Sidon. Julius treated Paul kindly, gave him liberty to go to his friends and receive care, and when we had put to sea from there, we sailed under the shelter of Cyprus, because the winds were contrary. And when we had sailed over the sea, which is off of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra, a city of Lycia. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing to Italy, and he put us on board. When we had sailed slowly many days and arrived with difficulty at Cnidus, the wind not permitting us to proceed, we sailed under the shelter of Crete off of Salmone. Passing it with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens near the city of Lycia." So we have a very, very direct, cataloged sort of accounting of all these different places that this ship went. The reason why this is the case is, again, because Luke, who is the author of this particular book, is with them on this ship. You notice that because of the language that's used there in verse 1. It says, "And when it was decided that we should sail to Italy," so Luke has rejoined here the scene and rejoined his friend Paul as they're moving from Caesarea, ultimately on their way to Rome. And again, the reason why this is taking place in our way of context is because Paul has appealed to Caesar, and so after this other trial we looked at last week, now Paul is set on his way to Rome, set there by Agrippa and Festus to be able to appeal to Caesar because of the accusations made against him by the particular sect of Jews. And so they do so in a very natural way, progressing together on this journey via a ship in these various places that they go. But as we will see throughout this story, it is filled with much trauma, with a lot of difficult encounters. But we begin here with the journey, and we see this new adventure unfolding for Paul, for Luke, and for others who are aboard with him. He's beginning this treacherous journey toward Rome. We note the different ways or the different areas that they stop. It says in verse 2, "Entering a ship of Adramyttium, we put to sea, meaning to sail along the coast of Asia." This was most likely a very small ship, a sort of passenger ship that would stop sort of coast to coast as they worked their way north, stopping in each sort of port, letting passengers on and off. It wasn't meant to be a long journey on this particular ship for them. And certainly, this particular ship was not on its way and setting sail for Rome. Julius would have understood that by meeting up at different ports, they would have been able to come to another ship that was on its way to Rome, and ultimately that is what they find. As the story continues here, it says in the second part of verse 2, Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, was with us, and the next day we landed at Sidon. And Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him liberty to go to his friends and receive care. It's an interesting note here that we have the encouragement of friends, and this word is tied to really believers. This is Christians that is being talked about here. We are not told in Acts about the church being formed here in this particular area. We are not told that the church in Sidon that Paul had visited previously, but undoubtedly his testimony and his ministry had expanded even there in the regions around that he had ministered to. And he is able to find some comfort there, some friends, some Christians, a local group of believers who he is permitted to go and to receive food from, care from, everything else. This is again, very unlike our modern day thinking of travel. You know, whether you're traveling on a plane or especially whether you're traveling on a cruise ship, all your needs are usually taken care of. You can have drinks, you can have food, you can have anything that you want. It's right there for you. Not the case in this ancient way of travel. As they stopped from port to port, it was up to those on the ship to receive for themselves the care and the needs and the necessities of everything that they had in order to survive. So Paul, as he stops here, is able to receive some encouragement from friends, which is not only his encouragement of, I'm sure, comfort and care, but also physical, material needs that he had as well. And so, is there something going on behind? Oh, wow. Thank you. All good? And so we continue to see how the Christian church expanding and taking care of the needs of one another. But as the story goes on, we see in verse 4, when we had to put to sea from there, we sailed under the shelter of Cyprus because the winds were contrary. You can see on your map there at the top of the notes how they are sailing sort of at the northern part of this island, and the reason so is to protect them from the winds that would be coming from that direction, and it's sort of serving as a blockade so that they would not be thrown off course. But they begin to already, early on in their journey, experience a little bit of difficulty. But they're able to take shelter there at Cyprus because the winds were contrary. And it goes on, verse 5, and when we had sailed over the sea, which is also off of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra, a city of Lycia. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing to Italy, and he put us on board. So they're making these stops sort of along the way, again, stopping at some of these various ports and all these places you can sort of see laid out on the map there. But the thought is that they would eventually be able to reach up with another ship that was indeed headed to Rome. And that's exactly what we see happen in verse 6. They found an Alexandrian ship. Now, this ship, which is a model of it sort of pictured here for you on the screen, would have been an Egyptian grain ship that was most likely privately hired by the Roman Empire to deliver grain from these various regions, Cyprus especially, and bring it to Rome. An important trade for them and a necessary one in relation to food. And so this was a large ship, over 100 feet long. It would have been able to accommodate many different people and certainly would have had a lot of storage, a lot of grain on it. And so here we have Paul and his friends who are able to hop aboard this particular ship and ultimately head and sail to Rome. But we have these other various locations along the way, and some places which may be familiar to you, some places which may not be. But a fun fact about one of them, this location of Myra, which is in modern-day Turkey, you all know a famous person that came from that particular city. You know who it is? St. Nicholas from Myra. There you go. There's your fun fact for the day. St. Nicholas, who punched that guy in the face, came from Myra. Anyways, we continue on. It's another story. Verse 7. When he had sailed slowly many days and arrived with difficulty off Cnidus, the wind not permitting us to proceed, we sailed under the shelter of Crete off of Salmone. Passing it with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens near the city of Lycia. So as they continue to travel, now we see that their travel is definitely being thrown off course. The way in which their boat is being pushed, in which it's setting sail, would not have been the typical journey that they would take to their final destination. So they're still moved here somewhat, instead of northerly, to the south of Crete, and they eventually find themselves here in a place called Fair Havens near the city of Lycia. And it is this trouble that ultimately Paul recognizes and realizes that maybe there's something wrong here. Maybe there's something that we need to take great care of as he sort of recognizes the danger that lies ahead. Verse 9. When much time had been spent and sailing was now dangerous because the fast was already over, Paul advised them, saying, "Men, I perceive that this voyage will end with disaster and much loss, not only of the cargo and ship, but also our lives." Now, what Paul is referring to here, because the fast was already over, is he's talking about the Day of Atonement. This particular feast, this particular day, or this actually is a fast, this moment of bearing the sins, and it's a somber Yom Kippur. They would have taken place towards the end of September, beginning of October. And sailing times for this particular area were typically running through about early November, and then ships would have to port because the winter was way too dangerous. The winds, the storms, everything was too dangerous, and they might be able to set sail again sometime in middle of February. And so Paul, recognizing some of the danger that lies ahead and recognizing that they're already in a dangerous sailing season and towards the end of sailing season altogether, is able to say, look, I don't think that this is a good idea. Now, I don't believe that what Paul says in verse 10 is necessarily a prophetic word. He says, "Men, I perceive that this voyage will end with disaster and much loss, not only of the cargo and ship, but also our lives." We'll see here in a bit, he gets a revelation, he gets a prophetic word from Christ himself, or from an angel of the Lord. But here I think that this is just Paul's expertise. You can read elsewhere in Scripture in Corinthians and see that Paul was well accustomed to shipwrecks. 3 different times in his life this would happen to him. He is no stranger to traveling on sea. He's no stranger to the dangers and the peril of these voyages. And so I think here is just Paul with a very natural understanding of the predicament that they find themselves in, with weather that's already been against them, saying, look, I perceive that we are going to be in some danger here. And that if we continue on, not only are we going to lose the ship, the cargo, but maybe we will die. But we see in verse 11 the response. Nevertheless, the centurion was more persuaded by the helmsman and the owner of the ship than by the things spoken by Paul. And because the harbor was not suitable to winter in, the majority advised to set sail from there also, if by any means they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete, opening toward the southwest and northwest, and winter there. Interesting, what we find here is this, is that we have a new authority which takes the scene here. Paul, up to this point throughout Acts, has really been seen as the authoritative figure, the one who is speaking on behalf of God, the one who is carrying the message of the gospel, the one who has sway with the Roman officials in these particular areas. And it would seem that Paul can exercise that authority here on this ship, and later on he will, but it doesn't happen right away. And he makes this suggestion of not continuing on, of staying here and wintering in this smaller port in Fair Havens, and yet he is outnumbered. The helmsmen say no, the centurion says no, and it seems that they took some sort of majority vote, or at least got opinions from others who were there, and they said, no, let's continue on, let's set sail just a little bit further. It was probably only about 40 or 50 miles from where they were in Fair Havens to get ultimately to that northerly part of Phoenix on Crete. That would be much better position for them to winter for the few months that sailing would have been totally impossible. So it was not a long journey. In fact, it probably should have only taken them a few hours to move from one location to another if the wind was favorable for them. So they decide this seems like the best thing to do. This Fair Havens port, the location is not totally known today, but where they believe it is, it's a small port. It receives a lot of weather from both sides. The city itself is very small, and so they may have felt this isn't the best place for us to stay for these few months. If we just go a little bit further, we will be able to be in a better position. And so they decide to journey forward. However, we see that this is not a wise decision, and now trouble is beginning to start. And so we move into the storm here of the text. Look at verse 13. When the south wind blew softly, supposing that they had obtained their desire, putting out to sea, they sailed close by Crete. But not long after a tempestuous headwind arose called Euroslydon, when the ship was caught, they could not head into the wind. We let her drive, and running under the shelter of an island called Clauda, we secured the skiff with difficulty. When they had taken it on board, they used cables to undergird the ship, and fearing lest they should run aground on the Syrtis sands, they struck sail and so were driven. It seems that very shortly after they set off of Fairhavens, headed towards Phoenix, that this, what is really translated to northeaster, comes. It's a dreaded storm, here described this tempestuous wind, this cyclone sort of storm that would have come off of the mountains of Crete and would have come across them and met with this northeasterly wind and caused some great sailing conditions, some dangerous sailing conditions. And here it is expressed as tempestuous. It's a cyclone-like, it's hurricane-like. It's a terrible, terrible storm, dreaded by these sailors. But this is what they face. In verse 15, it says, when the ship was caught and could not head into the wind, we let her drive. They sort of had to let the ship just go wherever it was going to go. And running under the shelter of an island called Clauda, we secured the skiff with difficulty, the lifeboat, the dinghy that they would have brought aboard. And when they had taken it on board, they used cables to undergird the ship, and fearing lest they should run aground on the Syrtis sands. They would have tied some cables or chains under the hull of the ship to try to hold it together because of all the waves and everything else tossing the ship about. The inclusion here of the Syrtis sands is significant because of their well-known danger that they would have caused. These Syrtis sands just off the northern coast of Africa were a known danger for many sailors in that region. In fact, it was often referenced as a graveyard of ships. Long sandbanks that would extend out past the coastline would oftentimes leave ships aground, and they would leave them shipwrecked, and people were left distraught and were left without any hope of escape. So here, Luke recognizes, as others do on the ship, that there's a very real possibility that if they continue on the journey that they're on, they will hit these Syrtis sands, and then all hope would be lost. Verse 18, because we were exceedingly tempest-tossed, the next day they lightened the ship. On the third day, we threw the ship's tackle overboard with our own hands. Undoubtedly, they were throwing some of the grain that was transported here overboard. Not all of it, because we'll see they eat some of it later on. But they're throwing grain over. They're throwing any maybe possessions over, anything that would weigh the ship down and attempt to lighten it to keep it afloat. This other indicator here that they were able to take the tackle overboard with their own hands is not quite as certain, but it could have been sort of the horizontal beam that would have attached to the mainsail that they took off and threw overboard in order to lighten the ship, as it would have had a significant weight to it. But they're doing anything and everything they can to stay afloat, and they recognize certainly the danger that is before them. But it gets even worse. Verse 20. Now when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest beat on us, all hope that we should be saved was finally given up. Many, many days they're here, throwing all these things off, trying to lighten the load, lighten the ship, and it says the sun and the stars had not appeared for many days. Important for sailors, the stars, so they would know their location, which way to sail. The sun coming, meaning that maybe the storm would have ceased or passed. But now this is not the case for them. We'll see ultimately that this continues for 14 days that they are like this, suffering, trying to find a way to stay alive. But Luke inserts this note here that all hope that we would be saved was finally given up. Hope of salvation is lost. And I think here in the text, this probably has a bit of a double meaning for us. It's not only a physical rescue that they are awaiting, but also maybe indicating a spiritual rescue. What's interesting about this particular story and how it's viewed, especially in light of other sort of sea voyages we see in Scripture, especially Jonah, but also other ones that would exist in some of these ancient texts, is that whenever there is a storm that keeps assaulting a particular ship, the hope of salvation seems to reside in a person on the ship who has done wrong. We recognize that from the story of Jonah. Jonah is the reason, he's the cause of the storm, that comes upon that particular ship. And when they throw him overboard, the storm ceases. Here we might suspect that this is the same thing, that this storm is continuing and it's pounding against the ship and it's persisting because God is trying to judge them for something that somebody has done wrong. But this is not the case. In fact, it is a person on the ship who will be the means of salvation for them, who will be the means of bringing wisdom to them that they need to hear to continue and to remain and to not try to escape, which will ultimately save them. This sort of double entendre, this dual meaning here of physical salvation is present for them. They will be saved, but there is a greater purpose and need for them as well. And the person who is on the boat, who is taking a salvation message to Rome and to those who so desperately need to hear it, will also be delivered. So we have a very significant theme running through the rest of this text. The physical, perilous journey that they face, but also a spiritual battle taking place as well. We move now even further. Verse 21, it says this, "But after long abstinence from food, then Paul stood in the midst of them and said, 'Men, you should have listened to me and not have sailed from Crete and incurred this disaster and loss. And now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship.'" We move now into this theme of deliverance. And Paul is able to hear, I think, I don't know exactly how he said it, but he gives one of the best "I told you so's" that you could ever hope for. You should have listened to me and not have sailed from Crete and incurred this disaster and loss. I don't think Paul is saying this in a sort of "I told you so" kind of way, but in an authoritative way. Remember, his authority has been usurped. It is the sailors, it is the others, it's the captains, it's the helmsmen who said, "No, don't listen to him, let's do this." Yet Paul, certainly one who's been experienced in these things, who is close with God, who recognizes God's sovereign plan in bringing him on the ship, taking him to Rome, would have been someone worth listening to. And now, with no other hope, they really have no choice. He says, "I urge you to take heart. There will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For there stood by me this night an angel of God to whom I belong and whom I serve, saying, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must be brought before Caesar, and indeed, God has granted you all those who sail with you. Therefore take heart, men, for I believe God, that it will be just as it was told me.'" And this is a great message of hope and deliverance. The climax of the storm. Paul is bringing a message that these men desperately need to hear. The wind is tossing them around. The sea is tempestuous. They are certainly going to drown. The ship is going to break apart, being held together by cords or chains. Everything is taking on water. The wind is howling. It's been dark for days. They don't know what's going on. They're just praying for some break, for some deliverance. And then Paul, seemingly in this sort of great climax of a story where, like it's from the movies, comes to the forefront as these men are struggling and doing these things, and he says, you should have listened to me. You just need to take heart. We are not going to die. It's going to be okay. But the reason why he knows it's going to be okay is probably not for the reasons that they would expect. Maybe Paul has some understanding of the stars or of winds or something and recognizes that this is going to pass. Maybe he has some other practical way in which he can help move the ship a different area and get away from this particular storm. But what he says is, he says, "An angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve came to me and told me, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must be brought before Caesar. And indeed, God has granted you all those who sail with you.'" Paul's statement to them would be astonishing. Don't worry, we're not going to die. God has promised that he has something for me to do. He has a plan for me. And if we die, that plan's not going to come to fruition. That promise will not come true. God has granted you and all those who sail with you. Therefore take heart, men. I believe God that it will be just as what it was told me. Paul is recognizing here, both from this promise and what he's been told before, that he is set to go to Rome. He knows God is going to take him there. He has been confronted with other opportunities where it seems like that wouldn't be the case. He was in prison for 2 years. He was beaten. He was assaulted. He was put on trial multiple times. He had his life plotted against. He would have been killed. And yet he's continually reminded, Paul, take heart. I have a plan, a purpose. You're going to Rome. And now finally on his way there, this terrible storm comes. And maybe again, Paul would think, there is no way I am making it to Rome. But an angel comes and says, Paul, do not be afraid. You must be brought before Caesar. You are going to make it. You are going to go. And all of those who are with you should take heart, because they too will survive. And Paul's comment, I believe God that it will be just as it was told me, is highly significant for us. We have here an understanding of God's sovereign purposes that will prevail. There is nothing that will stop God's sovereign will. Not a thing. No storm, no person, no king, no president, no rulers, no antichrist, nothing will stop God's sovereign purpose and will. The promises that we hold so dearly in Scripture, the promises that we so look forward to, the things about God that we know He can and does do in our life, and He tells us He will do if we trust, if we obey, whatever it may be, these promises from God are guarantees, and they cannot be taken away. Yet we often act as if they can. Times get tough, things get difficult, we begin to question, we begin to doubt, and we say, God, why are you doing the things that you are doing? If anybody had an opportunity to doubt, it would have been Paul. Surely there must be a better way. Your promises will prevail, yes, but why go through all this? Why not just invent the airplane and take me to Rome easy? But he trusts in God's plan regardless. I believe, God, that it will be just as it was told me. Nothing that God has promised for us will be taken from us. It is His sovereign purpose and will. It will be done. He ends this wonderful recognition of God's sovereign purposes with what I find to be a somewhat humorous line. Don't worry, you'll be saved. God has purposed me, and He has planned that this is going to happen. I'm going to Rome before Caesar. Take heart, men. It is going to happen just as God has told it to me. You will survive. But before that happens, we're going to have to run aground on a certain island. This ship is going down. Wouldn't seem to be the most heartening news, but even Paul recognizes that even in the face of destruction, God's purposes remain. Interesting word that is used here in verse 24. If you have the New King James, it's translated, God has granted you all those who sail with you. The word in the Greek is charizomai, which is a word that comes from the word charis, which is grace. God has demonstrated His grace to all those who sail with you. It is not because of anyone's doing, it's not Paul's doing, it's not the sailors' doing, it's not some means that they have to keep themselves afloat and alive. This is evidence God's sovereign purpose taking place because of His divine grace. We recognize that in our own lives. We don't receive what we receive. We don't have the promises that we have. We don't have the hope that we have because we're good people, because we've made all the right decisions, because we've earned it or we deserve it in some way. We have what we have, and we hope because God's grace is upon us. Continue on in verse 27. When the 14th night had come, as we were driven up and down in the Adriatic Sea, about midnight the sailors sensed that they were drawing near some land. They took soundings and found it to be 20 fathoms, and when they had gone a little further, they took soundings again and found it to be 15 fathoms. Then, fearing lest we should run aground on the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. So as they begin approaching closer to land, they're taking some measurements in the water and realizing that the depth of the water is becoming shallower and shallower, recognizing that they better slow down or prepare to get up onto land somehow, otherwise the ship is going to ultimately wreck. That shouldn't be surprising, as Paul's already told them this is going to take place. So they drop 4 anchors and anticipate to slow down the ship a bit to stop the wind from pushing it so fast. And it says, as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship, when they had let down the skiff into the sea under pretense of putting out anchors from the prow. Certain sailors who were responsible for taking the anchors and putting them out to slow the ship down were using that as excuse to get into the lifeboat that they had taken on board, to put it back off board, and to escape themselves. Now, this would seem like a reasonable solution if these men were able to go to shore, one come back, go to shore, and take people back and forth, but that is not their purpose. Their purpose was to flee. Their purpose was to escape. And ultimately, without these men, without their help, no one on the ship would survive. And Paul attests to that in verse 31. Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved. And the soldiers cut away the ropes of the skiff and let it fall off. Again, this seems counterintuitive to the resources that they would need. It seems like, hey, if we can keep this lifeboat on board, then we'll be able to use it once we do sort of run aground to maybe get people on and off and get them to safety. But that which would be useful to them was going to be used as a vessel to do something which would be against them. It was going to be used to allow some to escape, seeking their own life, not the life of others. Disregarding Paul's message, disregarding Paul's revelation of salvation granted by God. So Paul, by this time, has gathered a lot of influence, undoubtedly has become an authority for those on the ship, and they trust his word again, and they cut the lifeboat off, allowing it to seemingly drift off to sea. As day was about to dawn, verse 33, Paul implored them all to take food, saying, today is the 14th day you have waited and continued without food and eaten nothing. These men were tired, they were hungry, they have been working tirelessly, their emotions are all over the place, they think they're going to die. Food is the last thing that they probably thought of. And Paul recognizes that they need their strength. It's been 14 days and they haven't eaten anything. Again, in great contradiction to cruises of modern day. In 14 days on a cruise today, you could gain 100 pounds, guaranteed. Food aplenty. For 14 days, they don't eat. Verse 34, therefore I urge you to take nourishment, for this is for your survival, since not a hair will fall from the head of any of you. Interesting phrase that he would say that not a hair would fall from the head, because it certainly seems at this point that's exactly what's going to happen. Someone is going to die, it seems. There's no way that they would all stay alive. Verse 35, when he had said these things, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of them all. And when he had broken it, he began to eat. They were all encouraged and took food for themselves. And in all were 276 persons on the ship. So when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship and threw out the wheat into the sea. We have a really amazing scene in the midst of all of this where Paul takes some of the grain, some of the bread that is on board, and he breaks it and he gives thanks, and they all take a moment out of this terrible storm and this stressful scene to eat. There is certainly some picture here of a Lord's Supper, although that is not what Paul is doing. He's not conducting a communion service on the boat. He's simply giving thanks for that which God has provided for them. But the theme and the illusion of it can't be lost on the readers, and certainly Luke in his writing would understand the significance behind this, both for those that would read it now, but even for the Christians who are on board. And I think here what we have in this scene of Paul breaking bread is a reminder of Christ's fellowship. For the Christians that are on board, Luke included, Paul included, we have Aristarchus, who is also included, who we read about later in one of Paul's epistles. You have to wonder, these Christians are probably thinking, how did we get into this? They've come to assist Paul. They've come to help him on his way to Rome. They want to be a benefit to him in his ministry. They've journeyed together with him. They're thinking, finally, we are setting course on God's plan. And this happens. And everyone is struggling and wrestling. In 14 days, no one has eaten. Their minds totally consumed by just trying to stay alive. And in the midst of all that, Paul breaks bread in a similar manner to what we'd be reminded of Jesus breaking bread with his disciples, Jesus at the Lord's Supper, Jesus in the midst of many others providing that fellowship through food. And it's a reminder, I think, for those on board who could make the allusion to the fellowship in Christ. That even though there is hardship, even though there is seemingly death awaiting, Christ is still before them. Thanksgiving to God for what he provides. A reminder of the sacrifice of Christ, a reminder of the death of Christ for those he came to save. A reminder of his wonderful fellowship through his sufferings and through his salvation. Again, this double meaning of the physical salvation brought by food, but also a spiritual understanding as it looks and alludes to the fellowship of Christ and what was provided and offered on the cross. It would not have been in the hearts and minds of many of the sailors. They would have thought nothing of it. But for Paul and for others, they certainly would understand the significance. So they throw the rest of the food out. They lighten the ship even more. And then we see here in verse 39, when it was day, they did not recognize the land, but they observed a bay with a beach onto which they planned to run the ship if possible. It seems the storm has surpassed a bit. They find some land that they say, hey, I think we can run the ship aground. We can get to shore here. It says, so they let go the anchors and left them in the sea. Meanwhile, loosing the rudder ropes, and they hoisted the mainsail to the wind and made for shore. They're full steam headed now towards shore. But striking a place where two seas meet, they ran the ship aground. And the prow struck fast and remained immovable. But the stern was being broken up by the violence of the waves. So they hit some particular, whether it's a sandbank or a particular rocky area where these waves are coming together, and the ship now is aground, but it's offshore. They're not easily able to go from the ship onto the shore. And remember that boat that they had with them that would have been good for doing that? Well, they cut that loose, and that's no longer on the boat anymore. So now they're wondering what to do. And as this is happening, the rear of the boat is being pounded by these breakers, pounded by these waves, and the ship is beginning to break apart. Verse 42, and the soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, lest any of them should swim away and escape. They thought that this is a great opportunity for those who are imprisoned on this ship, whether it's Paul or whether it's others who are on their way to Rome, that they would flee. Clearly, the only way to get to land was to jump off ship into the sea, and maybe they would swim away someplace. So they thought, let's just kill all of them. We don't want them to escape. But the centurion, this would be Julius, wanting to save Paul, kept them from their purpose and commanded that those who could swim should jump overboard first and get to land. Wonderful sovereignty of God on display again, recognizing how he's used even Paul in his relationship with Julius through this whole time. His authority that he's gained on this voyage, that his life would be spared. Had it not been for Paul, all of these men would have died. Yet Paul again becomes, in a way, the salvation for those on ship. It says in verse 44, the rest, those who couldn't swim, this would be me, included in that particular group. Some on boards and some on parts of the ship. And so it was that they all escaped safely to land. It's a benefit that the ship broke up because it allowed them to do a, what's her name, Rose from Titanic, right? To float on one of the boards of the ship and to continue on to land. But we see God's sovereignty involved in this, and certainly we see the purposes of man being thwarted. Verse 43, the centurion wanting to save Paul kept them from their purpose. And we see how God's purpose comes to fruition. Everyone is safe no one has passed, and they have survived this treacherous storm. A couple of points I think we should recognize. Turn to Romans chapter 1, if you would. Paul wrote this book before this journey. This was most likely written during his third missionary journey. So this was before his imprisonment. This was before, certainly, the shipwreck here. And if we read in verse 8, he says, "First, I thank my God through Jesus Christ for you all, that your faith is spoken of throughout the whole world. For God is my witness, whom I serve with my spirit in the gospel of his Son, that without ceasing I make mention of you always in my prayers, making request, if by some means now, at last I may find a way in the will of God to come to you. For I long to see you, that I may impart to you some spiritual gifts, so that you may be established, that is, that I may be encouraged together with you by the mutual faith, both of you and me. I do not want you to be unaware, brethren, that I often planned to come to you, but was hindered until now, that I might have some fruit among you also, just as among the other Gentiles. I'm a debtor both to Greeks, to barbarians, both to wise, to unwise. So as much as is in me, I am ready to preach the gospel to you who are in Rome also." Paul clearly had a desire to go there. He had a desire to travel. He had a desire to impart the message of the gospel, the hope of Jesus Christ, to those who were in Rome. A central location, really the hub of that ancient world, that he would be able to reach so many different groups if he was able to make it to Rome. I wonder what Paul would think about having written this and maybe reading it or thinking of it later on, about how hindered he would be even more. I was hindered until now. I had planned to come to you to have fruit among you. Yet Paul endures imprisonment, and he endures shipwreck, perilous journey, all to get to Rome. And we'll see next week it doesn't even stop there. But he has a mission. He has a command from God that this is what he has been called to do. I think for us an important question is this: what lengths am I willing to go? I got to be honest with you. I wouldn't have made it even to the ship. I wouldn't have made it out of imprisonment, I'm sure. But if I'm on that ship, I'm in that lifeboat hoping to escape somewhere, guarantee. I mean, me on a plane, like 2 seconds of turbulence, and you've never seen someone pray so hard. You know, I just, travel, perilous journeys, not my cup of tea, right? I can't imagine what Paul's thinking during this time. God, there has to be a better way. If you want me to go to Rome, why can't you just bring me safely there? Why do you got to cause all this destruction? Why does the ship have to be wrecked? Why all these terrible sort of scenes that are taking place? Haven't I suffered and endured enough? But we never get that attitude from Paul, do we? In whatever context, in whatever situation, whatever means, a trust in God and a willingness to do what he's been commanded to do. Things are tough. Things are hard. Yet Paul is still willing to go. We have commands for us in Scripture, how God wants us to live, how he wants us to be a light or a testimony. And those things aren't always easy to do. But we can often give up. It doesn't take much for us to find some excuse to say, you know what, that's just really, I don't think that's what God would want for me. Sounds a little hard. If you ever think that, just think back to Paul. On a ship, tossed around at sea, 2 weeks, no sun, no stars, not eating, suffering all around, and he's still willing to go. Turn to Psalm 46. I wonder if this psalm passed through the mind of Paul as this was taking place. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear. Even though the earth be removed, and though the mountains be carried into the midst of the sea, though its waters roar and be troubled, though the mountains shake with its swelling, there is a river whose streams shall make glad the city of God, the holy place of the tabernacle of the Most High. God is in the midst of her, and she shall not be moved. God shall help her just at the break of dawn. The nations raged, the kingdoms were moved. He uttered his voice, the earth melted. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. Come, behold the works of the Lord, who has made desolations in the earth. He makes war cease to the end of the earth. He breaks the bow and cuts the spear of the bow and cuts the spear in two. He burns the chariot in the fire. Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. This psalm, focusing on the promises that lay ahead for Israel, even in the midst of difficult circumstances. Though the earth is removed, the mountains carried in the midst of the sea, the waters roar and be troubled, the mountains shake with its swelling, there is a river whose streams shall make glad the city of God. It looks ahead and says, even though things might be perilous now, even though things might be so bad now, even though things might be difficult and hard, and I'm trying but I don't understand, and even though things in my life might be scary and I can't quite understand what it is that God is doing, how his purposes are working, how he is still sovereign and in control of these things, it does not lose hope and is not afraid, because there is still the promise of what lies ahead. And God's promises and God's sovereign will never and can never and won't ever be thwarted. So like Paul in the midst of a stormy sea, what do I have to fear? Things may be taking place in your life, circumstances and others that you just aren't sure why they're happening the way that they are. They might be fearful, they may be scary, they may seem unfair to you. But take comfort in knowing that God's purposes will prevail. Do not be afraid. Take refuge in God. Be still and know that he is God. And in the midst of all of that chaos, trust in him and be willing to continue to be obedient to him no matter what. As we think about the communion service, again, my mind goes to Paul and the scene of breaking bread on that ship. I know that there are many of you, and again, together as a church family, it's been a difficult couple of months. A lot of sickness, a lot of loss, a lot of grief. Depressing weather doesn't help. Yet what we are able to observe here at the Lord's table is a reminder similar to that of Paul, that even in the midst of hardships of life, Christ is still before us. We still have the fellowship of Christ. We fellowship in his sufferings, in his body, in his blood. And as we do so, we fellowship in the glory and the hope of a future that can't be thwarted and that won't be taken away. I invite you to stand, if you would.